Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's impromptu seminar at the Institute of Advanced Research on Artificial Intelligence in Vienna. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Dr. Dmitry Krotov is today's speaker. He is a physicist working on neural networks and machine learning. Dmitry received his PhD in physics from the Princeton University in 2014. After his time at the Institute of Advanced Study, he joined the MIT-IBM Watson AI Lab in Cambridge, and there his research focuses on studying the properties of neural networks and also the relations to structures seen in neuroscience. In his recent paper with Professor Hopfield, he has shown how biologically plausible models with hidden layers can be transformed into the modern architectures used in machine learning, including Hopfield networks with continuous states. Actually, our own Sepp Hochreiter had before linked the update rules for these with the attention mechanism in transformer networks. So now we have biologically plausible microscopic neural models linked to the latest highly successful architectures in machine learning, which I find really exciting. It is thus with great pleasure that I welcome Dmitry, truly a kindred soul, to our IRI seminar, where he will tell us more about his work.
So David, thanks so much for the invitation and this very nice introduction. I'd like to start this seminar with a definition of associative memory. So what is associative memory? Associative memory is a general recurrent neural network. And the unusual aspect of this neural network is that in addition to all the sort of familiar properties of recurrent neural networks that we typically work with, this one has an additional mathematical feature associated with it that is called an energy function. And the idea is that you have a bunch of patterns that are denoted here by the letters size. And you would like to design a shape of the energy function in such a way so that it has a bunch of local minima, so that each local minimum corresponds to one of those patterns. And you can think about operation of associative memory in the following way. You can think about the state of the network as this kind of red ball that you can see in the slide. And as associative memory does the computation, the red ball slides down the hill along the energy landscape until it reaches one of the local minimum. And once it reaches that local minimum, we can say that associative memory has recalled one of the memorized states. The sort of most typical use cases of associative memory is the so-called pattern completion task. So what I mean by that is the following. Imagine, for example, that we take, a bunch of high-resolution images and we embed them in this energy landscape as local minima of the energy function. If we do that, then we can start from some initial state. For example, we can take an initial Q, which is a beak of some bird that you can see in this slide. And then we can let associative memory do the computation. And as associative memory computation progresses, you can see that it recalls a nice image of the lorikeet. In the second example, what I did is I took, again, some nice image and I added a huge amount of noise to it. So that by and large, if you look at that gray square, you can't really see what's going on in there. However, again, if we give it to the associative memory network and we let it compute, associative memory clears out the noise and recovers a nice image of the ball. And also, by the way, notice that if I take this second animation and I stop it somewhere in the middle, you can see that in addition to the ball, you can also see a ghost image of the same lorikeet. And that's kind of, illustrates the general intuition behind the computation that associative memory does. So its computation, it involves collective properties of multiple neurons and also many memories that kind of, all interact with each other. So let me take this general idea and try to make it a little bit more mathematically defined. And in this slide, I'm going to compare two kinds of neural networks, the standard associative memory network or classical Hopfield network, and dense associative memory, or as we call it, modern Hopfield network. So in the classical Hopfield net case, the central object is this energy function that you can see here in the left portion of the slide. And basically, the state of this network in the binary case is a lone vector of -1s and +1s, so it's a binary vector. And the shape of this energy function is encoded in the matrix Tij that you can see in the slide. So Tij is essentially a matrix of the outer products of the memory vectors. If you take this expression for Tij and plug it into the definition of the energy, you can easily see that you can slightly rearrange the sums over all the indices I, mu, etc. so that you can rewrite this energy function in this simple form. So essentially, in order to calculate the energy, what you need to do is this. You need to take the state vector of the network, you need to multiply it by the memory vector psi, and then you square the overlap. And that's pretty much the energy. And it turns out that if you consider the situation when the memory patterns psi are random patterns that are drawn from some nice and smooth distribution, you can prove that the largest number of memories that such system can store and reliably retrieve is roughly speaking equal to 0.14 n, where capital N is the size of the network or the number of visible units in this network. And if you think about this, that just isn't enough. Think about this in the following way, for example. Imagine that we are thinking about memories as a small patches of images that are 30 by 30 pixels, right? And let's say that the images are binary, so that each pixel can either be black or white. So if that is the problem, that what this formula tells us is that there is no way we can store more than 0.14 of 900 memories in such a system. And obviously, if you think about patches of images 30 by 30 pixels, you can easily imagine way more possible combinations and possible meaningful images of that sort that you might want to remember. But yet, this bound tells us that this is not possible. And moreover, it turns out that if the patterns psi are not random, but rather have some meaningful structure of correlations, which is typically the case for real world data, then this bound might be even worse. So you might not be able to even store 0.14 n patterns. For this reason, there is a question: can we do something about this? And can we somehow change this model in such a way so that this capacity bound is improved? And that's what the idea behind dense associative memories or modern Hopfield networks is. So essentially, the energy function for the modern Hopfield networks looks very similar. It's shown here. And the only difference compared to the classical Hopfield network is that instead of taking the overlap and raising it into the second power, we are going to apply some more complicated function f of x to it. And specifically, the key aspect of this function is that it should grow sufficiently rapidly. Then the memory storage capacity will be high. So specifically in this talk, I will be interested in two examples of such functions. One example is a power function, x to the power n, assuming that the power n is greater than 2. And the second example is an exponential function. And it turns out that if you do the simple replacement and replace the overlap squared by a function of the overlap, then the capacity of this network significantly increases. And more specifically, you can show that the capacity for the power function now scales like n to the power n minus 1, and for the exponential function, it can even be exponentially big. And I'm not really planning to prove these results to you during this talk, but if you're interested, you can look them up in one of these two papers that are mentioned in this slide. However, I do want to communicate a general intuition about why this is the case, why it is a good idea to have an energy function that grows very rapidly. And in order to understand this, let's take a look at the update rule of the modern Hopfield network. So the update rule in its most general form is shown at the top of this slide. So essentially what this formula tells us is how we can calculate the state of the network at the moment of time t plus 1 given the state of the network at the moment of time t. So sigma t here is the state of the network at the moment of time t. And essentially what we see from this formula is that the state of the neurons at the next moment of time is a sine function of some complicated expression, but this complicated expression is nothing but the difference of two energies. So the first term is the energy of the configuration when all the units, except for the ith one, the one that we are trying to update, being clumped to their current states, and the ith unit being in the +1 state. And the second term is a similar expression, but when the ith unit is clumped to the -1 state. So what this update rule does, it calculates those two energies, and then the sine function selects the state that corresponds to the lowest of those two energies. So that's what this update rule actually does. Now, it turns out that if you take the limit when the size of the network is big, when the number of neurons is much bigger than 1, then you can simplify this expression a little bit. So specifically, you can take the function capital f of x and Taylor expand it. And if you do that, you can easily show that you can simplify that formula to obtain this formula in the middle, this one, where the function lowercase f of x is the derivative of the function capital f of x. And what this formula tells us is that if we are trying to calculate the state of the network at the next moment of time, what we need to do is to consider a weighted sum over all the memory vectors with the coefficients proportional to this function lowercase f of the overlaps between the corresponding memories and the state vector. And now let's take a look at this last formula from the perspective of classical Hopfield networks and modern Hopfield networks. So in the classical net, the function capital F of x is quadratic, which means that its derivative, the function lowercase f of x, is linear. And what this means is that if we give to the network some state and we look at all the memories that are excited by that state, and let me denote by xi mu hat the memory that has the largest excitation, which has the largest overlap with the current state. And xi mu is the memory that has the second largest excitation. So basically, when this function f of x is linear, then the small increment on the x-axis produces a small increment on the y-axis, right? However, if we are going to the regime of modern Hopfield networks and this function grows very rapidly, then a small increment on the x-axis produces a much bigger increment on the y-axis. And that's essentially the intuition of why the memories in these modern Hopfield networks, they do not get confused with each other. Because basically, when we present some pattern and the largest memory gets activated, the subleading memories, you need to have really a large number of those to be able to outweigh the contribution of the top memory. So that's kind of, essentially the general intuition of why these neural networks have a large memory storage capacity. And you can arrive at the same argument by analyzing the energy functions as opposed to update rules like we did here. So the conclusion is that if we go from the limit of classical Hopfield networks to the limit of modern Hopfield networks, the basins of attraction become deeper and more and better separated from each other. But you might already see that there is a little bit of a problem with modern Hopfield networks. And let me try to illustrate what this problem is by going back to this update rule that we have just derived and looking at it in a bit more detail. So let's again take this update rule and now let's write it down more explicitly for the case of the classical Hopfield network with the function f of x being linear. If that is the case, then we can simply drop the function f of x and put the overlap here underneath the sine function, right? Moreover, we can explicitly calculate the sum with respect to the memory index mu and replace the product of two vectors xi in this formula by the matrix of synaptic connections Tij, which is defined this way. And if we do this, then we will end up having this very nice expression for the update rule, which basically tells us the following, that for each neuron, in order to calculate its output, what it does is the following. It looks at all the neurons that are part of the network, then weights the activities of those neurons with some coefficients that are denoted by Tij, and then passes the result through some nonlinear activation function, which is chosen to be a sine function in this case. And this is basically what each neuron does. And if you think about this, this is pretty much how we typically think about conventional biologically plausible neurons in the artificial neural network world, right? So each neuron collects a bunch of inputs, multiplies them by some coefficients, and then passes the result through some nonlinearity. And that's exactly what this network does. Now, in contrast, if we look at the modern Hopfield network, even at a very simple one with the power function, when the function capital F of x is cubic, right? So let's say that the function capital F of x is cubic, and then the function lowercase f of x is going to be quadratic. Now, if we plug these functions into the general update rule that is shown here, you can see that underneath the sine function, we'll now have two factors of the overlap, right, as opposed to one. And now, if we evaluate the sum with respect to the index mu, we will end up having this object Tijk here, which is a symmetric tensor with three indices. And for this reason, if we would like to have a similar biological interpretation of this update rule, we would have to conclude that the neurons in this neural network have to collect inputs from pairs of other neurons, not from individuals. And that's just not what most neurobiologists would say is happening in real biological neural networks. And to be completely fair, maybe you can cook up some complicated biophysical mechanism that would be able to produce such a three-body interaction. But at the same time, if you consider an even a little bit more complicated neural network, for example, you replace the cubic energy function by the function of power 10, or you consider an exponential activation function. Then once you tailor expand that exponent, you would see that it will have a lot of terms with increasing number of overlaps and with increasing number of indices for the tensors t, I, j, k, blah, 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 right? And the coefficients in front of those tensors have to be specifically chosen to mimic the overall exponential function of the energy function. And it's just very hard to believe that something like this would ever be possible to implement in real biological neural net. For this reason, for the purposes of this talk, we will conclude that having more than two-body interactions between the neurons is not biological, and having two-body interactions between the neurons is perfectly biological. And also, you can arrive at the same argument again by looking at the energy function as opposed to the update code. And the conclusion is the same, that the classical Hopfield networks with quadratic energies naively are biologically plausible. And modern Hopfield networks with more higher order interaction terms in the energy function, at least from the perspective of this naive interpretation, are actually not biological or not biologically plausible. But at the same time, thanks to these two very exciting papers that appeared recently, Hopfield networks is all you need, and the accompanying paper on the immune repertoire classification, we know that these systems are pretty useful tools for solving complicated machine learning problems, right? And at the same time, they are also quite appealing from the perspective of cognitive sciences because they are able to store a huge number of memories. And for this reason, there is a question: can we do something about this annoying non-biological aspect of these modern Hopfield networks? Can we somehow rewrite them in such a way so that we get rid of these many-body interactions and we can write down the energy function and the update rule in a perfectly biologically plausible way? And this is what our latest paper is about. So basically, in this paper, what we show is that modern Hopfield networks can be thought of as effective theories that follow from some more microscopic theory that can be written in terms of biological variables. That microscopic theory has additional degrees of freedom, has additional neurons that do not appear in the effective theory. But once you exclude those neurons, or as we say in physics, integrate them out, then you will be able to find an effective theory on the visible neurons that that is equivalent, and that theory would be equivalent to modern Hopfield networks. So that's pretty much the main statement of this paper. And on the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you how one could construct this microscopic theory and how one could investigate its mathematical problem. So let's take a look at this theory. So basically, up until now, we only had blue neurons in all the figures that I have shown, right? So those are feature neurons or visible neurons. But now, in addition to these blue neurons, I'm going to add a bunch of green neurons that I'm going to call memory neurons or hidden neurons. Now, notice that now there will be two variables associated with the states of all those neurons. So there will be a variable that describes the internal state of the neuron. For the visible neurons, this internal state is denoted by the letter VI. And there will also be an activation for every neuron that is denoted by GI. And the corresponding variables for the hidden neurons are denoted as HMU for the internal state, and the activation is denoted by FMU. So if you are thinking about this network from the perspective of biology, the right way to think about internal state would be the current that runs through the neuron. And the right way to think about the activation would be as a firing rate of that neuron that is produced by the neuron and propagates along the axis. And if you're thinking about this network from the perspective of machine learning, then the right way to think about internal state would be a pre-activation of the neuron. So for example, if we're doing deep learning, internal state would be take a bunch of inputs, then multiply them by a matrix, and then add a bias. That would be the internal state. And the activation would be the result of application of the activation function, for example, a rectified linear unit to that internal state. So that's kind of the intuition behind the variables that I'm going to use. Now, let's take a look at the equations. So in these equations, all the variables are now going to be continuous. So the internal states, the activations, everything. So VI, FMU, GI, all the variables that you can see in the slide, they are no longer binary. And in some limiting cases later on, we will make them binary, but for now, let's assume that they are continuous. And we will also assume that the state of this network evolves in continuous time. So basically, we can describe the evolution of the activities as ordinary differential equations, and these differential equations will be highly nonlinear. So let's take a look at the first equation. So the first equation describes the temporal evolution of the internal state of the visible neuron. And basically what it tells us is that it is driven by the outputs from the hidden neurons. And similarly, the evolution of the hidden neurons is driven by the outputs of the visible neurons. And I have also added here a term proportional to the input current into the network, II, which basically represents the input into the feature input state, into the feature neuron space. But technically, we could drop that term because, and I think I'm going to drop it in most of my calculations later on. But let's keep it for generality for now. So it is convenient to think about this system by introducing a couple of additional variables. And these variables, I'm going to call them the Lagrangian functions for the hidden neurons and for the visible neurons. So they are denoted by LH and LV. So Lagrangian functions can be arbitrarily complicated functions of the activities of the hidden or the activities of the visible neurons. And the activation functions that you can see in these equations, GI and F mu, are defined as partial derivatives of these Lagrangian functions. Now, it turns out that if we take this nonlinear system of differential equations, one can show that this system of equations has a quantity associated with it that is called an energy function. And the energy function is given by this expression right here. So in the energy function, as we'll see in a moment, it monotonically decreases as the dynamics of the neural network evolves. So let's take a look at this energy function. It contains of three terms. So the first term in this bracket right here is essentially a Legendre transform of the Lagrangian for the visible units with respect to the internal states. The second term is a Legendre transform of the Lagrangian of the hidden unit. And the last term is the interaction terms between the visible units and the hidden units. Now, notice that if we look at this expression, the first bracket does not depend on anything but the activities of the visible unit. The second bracket only depends on the activities of the hidden units. And the only term that depends on both kinds of neurons, both the visibles and the hiddens, is the last term, which explicitly contains the parameters psi, right? And what we can do is we can take this general definition of the energy function and we can apply the chain rule to calculate the full-time derivative of the energy with respect to time. And if we do that, and if we apply the equations of motion in this chain rule, we can show that the time derivative of the energy function is given by the sum of two quadratic forms. The first term here is a quadratic form that is built on the matrix of second derivatives of the Lagrangian for the visible unit. And the second quadratic form is built on the matrix of second derivatives of the Lagrangian for the hidden units. And for this reason, you can see that if both of those two matrices are positive definite, then the energy is guaranteed to decrease in time on the dynamical trajectory described by those two neurons. And if you think about this, this is kind of pretty powerful statement because the equations that you can see here, they can be very complicated. So the functions f mu and gi, they can be very nonlinear and involve a lot of different neurons. And yet, if those activation functions, they come from a predefined Lagrangian function, we still have this nice theorem that would allow us to prove that the system converges to a fixed point. And of course, in order to prove that, we would also need to add another statement that the energy for a given Lagrangian is bounded from below. Right, so this is essentially the network that we are going to work with. And I should probably also mention a couple of things here. So first of all, the connectivity pattern that you can see in this slide is very similar to the connectivity pattern of the restricted Boltzmann machines. So essentially, there are only two kinds of connections between visibles and hiddens and between hiddens and visibles. But there are no connections within the hidden neuron layer and there are no connections between the visible neurons. And I should also mention that although I am referring to this network as biologically plausible implementation of modern Hopfield networks, the definition of biological plausibility that I'm adopting in this talk is the absence of many body synapses. And as you can see, this network indeed does not have any many-body synapses. It only has conventional structure of conventional neurons that basically collects input from other neurons, multiply them by coefficients, and produce their own outputs. However, there might be, and there are other aspects in which the system might not be biologically plausible. Specifically, one non-biological aspect of this network is that the strength of synapses that connect neuron I and neuron mu, and the strength of synapses that connect neuron mu and neuron I are assumed to be equal in this formula, because the matrix Xi that appears here is equal to exactly the same matrix Xi that appears in the formula above. And the reason why we need this condition is to be able to write down the energy function. We can easily relax that condition in this definition of the equations of motion, but then those equations of motion will not have the corresponding energy function. And technically, you can replace one of those matrices by a different variable, and that would be perfectly fine. And the last thing that I want to mention on this slide is that, so in the previous slides, we thought about synaptic strength as being constructed out of the memory vectors. They were denoted by the tensors Tijk with many indices. But now here you can see that the memory vectors Xi themselves become the strength of synaptic strength. And that's kind of another difference in the interpretation compared to the effective models that I discussed on the previous slides. So now let's take this general microscopic theory and let's take a look at some limiting cases that follow from it. So I'm going to start with the simplest case, which we call model A. In this case, the Lagrangian functions for both hidden and visible neurons are additive. So they're shown here. And you can see that the Lagrangian for the hiddens is a sum of potentially complicated and nonlinear functions f, but that entire sum is added. And even more specifically, I'm going to choose the nonlinear function g in the definition of the Lagrangian for the visible units to be equal to the absolute value of x, like it is shown here. Once we specify the Lagrangians, we have a general mathematical formulation. So we don't really have to think about anything. We can simply calculate partial derivatives of the Lagrangian with respect to the internal states in order to compute the activation functions. And if the Lagrangian is an absolute value of x, then its partial derivative is equal to the sign of x, and up to contact terms, which we don't care about in this calculation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this general definition of equations of motion and the general energy function, and then I'm going to simplify it for this specific case. One more simplification that I am going to use is the following. I'm going to assume that the dynamics of hidden neurons happens on a much faster time scale compared to the dynamics of the visible neurons. So specifically, what I'm going to assume is that when we present an input to the visible neurons, the hidden neurons, they operate very quickly and very quickly equilibrate and reach a steady state. If that is the case, then I can solve the second differential equation of this system, and I can express the activities of hiddens, h mu, through the activations of the visible units using this formula. Now, let's take a look at the general energy function. If the function g of x is equal to absolute value of x, and the activation function gi is equal to sine of vi, then you can see that the product of vi by gi, which is equal to sine of vi, is equal to absolute value of vi. And this absolute value of vi exactly cancels out with the absolute value of vi that comes from the Lagrangian function. Thus, if we assume that there is no input current in this formula, so I is equal to 0, this entire first bracket is identically equal to 0. For this model. Additionally, because of the steady state condition for the hidden neuron, you can see that the first term in the second bracket cancels out exactly with the interaction term that appears the last in the energy function, right? Because h mu is equal to xi mu I gi. And thus, the only term that survives in this entire energy function is the term proportional to the Lagrangian of the system for the hidden layer. And let's just write it down. So the energy function then is going to be reduced to this expression. So the Lagrangian is the sum of the functions f of h mu, and we can also express h mu through the activation gi and use the condition that the activation gi is equal to sine of vi, which we can denote it by the binary variable sigma I, because sine is equal to either plus 1 or minus 1. So we can denote it by an Ising-like variable sigma I. Thus, this entire complicated energy reduces to the simple form. And as you can see, this is something that we know, right? This is the familiar energy for a modern binary Hopfield networks that we started this talk with, that appeared on one of the previous slides. And if the function capital F of x is a power function, this reduces to the model considered in the first paper that is written, that is mentioned in this slide. And if the energy function f of x is an exponential function, then it reduces to the model considered in the second paper. Okay, so this is one limiting case. But now let's take a look at some other interesting limiting cases that follow from this general theory. The second case is what we call model B. In this model, it turns out that it reduces to the model considered in the paper Hopfield Networks is all unique. Again, we have a very streamlined derivation. We don't really have to think about anything. We just need to specify the Lagrangian functions, right? So the Lagrangian functions for this model are given by these two formulas. So LV is going to be additive, so it's the sum of squared of the activities of all the neurons. And the Lagrangian for the hiddens is going to be given by this expression. So it's a logarithm of the sum of the exponents. If we apply our general pipeline, we can calculate the activation functions. And for the hiddens, we get a softmax. And for the visible units, we get a linear activation function. Now, again, we are going to assume that the hidden units are fast. So we are going to integrate them out, and we're going to express the activities of hiddens through the activities of visible units. Now, if we again take a look at this first bracket, in this first bracket, gi is equal to vi, as we can see, right? Which means that the product of vi by gi is going to be equal to vi squared. And we have to subtract minus a half of vi squared that comes from the Lagrangian. Thus, this whole bracket for this model is going to be reduced to the final term, a half of vi squared, sum over I. So this is the first contribution to the energy function. Because of the fast equilibration condition for the hiddens, again, this term can be cancelled with this one. And the only term that is left is the Lagrangian function for the hiddens. So we put it in here, and we can express the activities of hiddens through the activities of the visible units using the fast equilibration condition. Thus, after we put all those things together, we end up having this very nice energy function that is the sum of two terms. And we can also use this fast equilibration condition in the first of the two dynamical equations of motion in order to find an effective equation of motion for the dynamics of the visible units. And if we do that, we will end up having this form. Now, it turns out that these two formulas are exactly the energy function and the update rule that was obtained in this paper that is mentioned here at the bottom of the slide. And the only difference between the equation of motion that we write here and the equation of motion considered in the paper Hopfield Networks is all you need is that our equation of motion is derived in continuous time. And Ramsauer and collaborators derived that equation in discrete time steps. But at the same time, we can take the continuous time differential equation and we can write it in finite differences. And if we do that, then we will end up having this equation. So basically, it tells us how we can calculate the state of the network at the next moment of time, given the state of the network at the current moment of time. And this is exactly the update rule from this paper. If we simply redefine some of the variables, so basically the states of the visible units were called by psi in that paper, and the memory patterns psi mu I were called by the matrix X transposed in that paper. So if we kind of change those notations, we can see that those two formulas are exactly identical to each other. And again, kind of the nice aspect of this derivation is that you don't really have to think about anything. It's sort of plug and play. You only have to specify the Lagrangian, and then all the terms in the energy function will appear in the right places with the correct coefficients without any additional assumptions. So for example, you can see that this term proportional to vi squared appears here just out of the general formalism. You don't have to justify its appearance because you want to bound the energy. It just simply follows from the general expression for the energy function. Okay, so this is the second example. model B. Now let's keep going and let's look at one more interesting model, which we call model C, and we also call this model spherical memory for reasons that I will explain in a moment. In this case, the Lagrangian for the hidden neurons is additive, but the Lagrangian for the visible units is not. The Lagrangian for the visible units is essentially equal to the overall length of the activation for the entire layer of visible neurons. Again, we have the Lagrangians. We can calculate the activation functions by simply taking partial derivatives. So if we do that, then we'll see that the activation function for the visible neurons is going to be equal to the unit vector that points in the direction of the activities of individual neurons. If we use the condition of fast equilibration, then we can simplify the general energy function and the general equations of motion in order to obtain these nice two formulas for the effective energy function and the effective update. Again, the nice aspect of this spherical case is that it has a very meaningful geometric interpretation. So basically, the Lagrangian just represents the length of the overall excitation of the neurons in the visible layer, and the activation function for the visible units represents a unit vector that points in the direction of the activations of that layer. So this is model C. And conceptually, what we are saying here is that we can start with this biologically plausible theory for modern Hopfield network that only has conventional pairwise synapses between pairs of cells. And by choosing various activation functions in the definition of this theory, we can reduce it to some of the known models, like model A or model B, and we can also derive some models that, at least to the best of my knowledge, have not been discussed in the literature before, like model C. And all those models then can be useful for some machine learning problems. I should also say that there's no statement here that this is a complete classification. So one could easily imagine a model D or model E or model F that might also be useful for some meaningful tasks. Another sort of thing that I want to add here is that if you do care about neurobiology, then this theory is interesting, right? Because basically what it says is that instead of considering these models where you would naively require many body interactions between the neurons, you actually don't need those. You can think about conventional pairwise interactions between neural cells. But even if you sort of take this stance that, we want to build powerful AI systems, and we don't really care if the underlying model comes from biology or not. What we care about is that it should work very well. Even from that perspective, this derivation might be valuable because basically it allows you to derive those theories in a unified way, sort of study mathematical relationships between different limiting cases. So that's basically the main result of our paper. And I think I'm going to stop here and I'm going to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. So what would the next steps be that you see in this work? I mean, I see that the model C has been proposed. Have you already looked into formulating that and testing it on some machine learning problems?
Right. Well, not yet. Regarding model C, not yet. Yeah, I think it would be interesting because it's kind of so nice and symmetric, but we haven't done that. And sort of more broadly, I think there is a couple of kinds of questions here. So one question that I would be extremely interested in, for example, is the following. It would be, I think, interesting to establish a general sort of phase diagram of all possible models of this class, right? So right now we kind of see that we have these models, and sometimes the capacity of these models looks like a power law, sometimes it looks like an exponent, and this depends on the definition of this function. Then there is this model that looks somewhat different from this one, but at the same time, we also know that sometimes it does have an exponential storage capacity, right? And it would be nice to to more generally investigate the space of all possible models and clearly say which models have exponential capacity, which models have power law capacity, which models have small capacity, etc. So this is one theoretical question, right? From the more practical perspective, I think there is obviously this very exciting question that you guys brought up that, indeed the system looks like a generalization of the attention mechanism in NLP systems. And indeed, if you provide a more flexible attention mechanism that can evolve multiple steps and do some form of pattern completion, this looks like a very promising setup for improving transformer architectures. Another question that I'm personally also extremely interested in is everything that we have discussed so far is about the architecture, right? So basically we have these nice networks and we can see theoretically that they indeed are able to store large number of memories. But at the same time, in machine learning, we, in addition to the architecture, we also have the learning algorithm, right? And currently, sort of the main learning algorithm that everyone is using is the backpropagation algorithm. But technically, there is a whole range of different possibilities here that such systems might be trained with. So, for example, there are very nice local learning algorithms that are based on various forms of Hebbian plasticity. There is backpropagation. There could be more interesting learning algorithms that are better suited for training these specific kinds of models. So that's, I think, another potentially quite exciting direction of exploration.
Hi, Dima. This is Sepp.
Hi.
First of all, what you're saying, I completely agree. There are methods out, also driven by Joshua Bengio, like equilibrium propagation, stuff like this. And they always had some problem with convergence, that they have systems which take a long time to converge. Perhaps this is also an idea. And they always argue that they have a local learning rule and don't have to do backpropagation through the whole system and stuff like this, which is biologically not so plausible. I agree. But my question is actually another one, sorry. You said it's biologically more plausible if we assume this, let's say, hidden neurons. Do you have any idea where we would find this in the brain? Because there are some discussions, has the brain this recurrent connections? There are some, but it takes time to go up and down again. Where would you look for such structures in the human brain, for example?
Right. So frankly, if you look at almost any part of the brain, you would see a lot of recurrent connections in it, right? So that's, recurrent connections are not really that difficult to find in the brain. It's kind of much more difficult to find places where you don't have recurrent connection. But the also important aspect of this construction is that in some sense, the network not only have to have recurrence, but it should also be expansive in some sense, right? Because basically, I think what in most machine learning applications, what we would like to do is the following problem. So we would like to have some fixed size of the input space, but then we would like to store many more patterns than that size of the input space. And as you can see in this biological theory that's shown right here, the number of memories that such system stores is bounded by the number of hidden neurons. Thus, in order to have a large number of memories, you actually do need to have a large number of hidden neurons. Not only you need to have a recurrent connectivity within the network, but you also need to have expansive networks. And expansive networks, indeed, they're kind of ubiquitous. To give you one example, there is a huge expansion in fruit fly olfactory system. So in the fruit fly olfactory system, there are these projection neuron cells, and then they send outputs to the Kenyan cells. And the number of Kenyan cells is 50 times bigger than the number of projection neurons. So, and actually like that, that specific part of fruit fly brain have long been hypothesized to be responsible for some form of associative learning. And yeah, there is a ton of examples in the brain where you have expansion and you have recurrent connectivity. So it's I would say it's quite a ubiquitous motif.
Perhaps along this direction, another question. What do you think about sparsity? I don't know whether it's very realistic that every neuron is connected to every hidden neuron. There is some locality, stuff like this. Would it make sense to have sparse connections that some visible neuron only connects to a few, perhaps locally neighboring hidden units?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right. It would be absolutely meaningful. And moreover, I am almost certain that you can write down, assuming some symmetry in the synaptic strength, you can write down an associated energy function and associated equations of motion for such a system. So Yeah, that's totally kind of, I think it's totally doable, and it's certainly very biological, and potentially it might also be useful for machine learning applications.
Also, what we would have is if you have sparse connection, we know it from ICA, independent component analysis, that then you get orthogonal connections. If you activate one neuron, it's unlikely that you activate another neuron with sparse connection, because the weights, the incoming weights, if there are so many zeros, if you make a dot product, it's very likely close to zero. Also, you have some decorrelation effect, maybe, but I didn't look into that.
Yeah. No, indeed, kind of, there is a ton of learning algorithm. You can do independent component analysis. You can do, there's actually a ton of Hebbian, like biologically inspired learning algorithms that do something like independent component analysis, PCA, and many other exciting things. And you can decorrelate patterns by, streaming data in an online fashion or using mini batches. So it's all possible to do, and potentially, I think, so kind of, in the future, I think what I would personally be excited about is some synergy between, some kind of, new learning algorithms and new architectures. And again, as I already said, I think what I have discussed in this talk is more a question about the architecture. And then there is a separate question, which is a very exciting question about how this architecture should be trained. And backpropagation is one option, which is a great option, but it's not the only option.
Very interesting.
Yeah, agreed.
Indeed. Well, I have one very quick question, Dmitry. The theta h in all your examples in model A, model B, model C is basically put to 0, which has the side effect that this cross term in your energy expression is canceling out. Have you ever considered cases or architectures where this is not 0?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can just, you don't have to do any simplifications, right? You can just take this general system of equations and just study it. And that's a perfectly, reasonable thing to do. It's just kind of, the reason why we wanted to show that, that there are these limiting cases is because you would like to kind of connect some, new set of equations that people are not familiar with something that people already know, right? But technically, like, this is a very meaningful system of equations, and potentially, this decoupling to hidden units and visible units might also be useful for learning, for example, right? If you want to do some kind of learning algorithm, it might be helpful to kind of have hidden units separate. So we don't have to always integrate them out. I'm sure there could be some, meaningful problems where it's a good idea to keep them.
Okay, maybe I can connect to this quickly. Biologically, from your insights in neuroscience, would you expect the feature neurons really to be faster, and why? Or, I mean, I can see that there could be a decoupling on different timescales. But from the neuroscience, do you have any indication how that might look like in biology? Whether the memory should be faster or the features should be faster, or
Right. So to be honest with you, I don't really kind of, I haven't really looked into neuroscience literature in that regard. But kind of, in general, brain is so complex that, and the neurons are so diverse that I'm sure that if you, try to find the system where you have fast hidden neurons in the brain, you will be able to do so. And if you want to find a system where, input neurons are fast in the brain, you would also be able to do so. I don't really have a good example where kind of, biologists would dissect the system and clearly demonstrate that indeed hidden neurons operate on a faster time scale. But I have no doubts that, such systems exist. I can look it up and I will send you an email about this, okay?
That's very kind. Very interesting. I have one final question for me. And it's actually, you're just on the right slide. So the energy function, and maybe here's my ignorance in physics speaking, but I recognize the first two terms as being Hamiltonians. And then the cross energy term is not time dependent, right?
Cross energy term.
The last term, the sum over
is time dependent.
mu. Yeah, okay.
Time dependent. Both gi
Yes,
and f mu are time dependent, and you need to differentiate all of them. Michael, let me also add something here, because we should have probably made it more clear in the paper, and I should have mentioned this in this talk already. So, like, you know, this terminology that we're using, we call like these functions Lagrangian functions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of indeed, as you pointed out, the reason why we use this terminology is because this is indeed like how in classical mechanics you compute energy function given the Lagrangian, right? But however, we are not really, there's no really a statement here that this whole system has all the structure of the Lagrangian mechanics. So for example, there is no statement that these equations can be obtained from the action principle or as Euler-Lagrange equations. So we're not making that statement. And also we're not making a statement that the energy function that is written this way is a kind of, you know, has a Hamiltonian structure. So we're not really like studying Poisson brackets between momenta and coordinates. None of that structure exists in this system, at least in the naive formulation. Maybe you can, you know, come up with such a structure and it would be useful for something. But at least naively, the only reason why these functions are called Lagrangian functions is because of the Legendre transform structure of the transformation between the Lagrangian and the corresponding energy function.
That helps. So thanks very much indeed. It would be nice to find a total Hamiltonian, but maybe, as you rightly say, that's not possible.
Yeah, I don't know. It may or may not be possible. I haven't thought about this, to be honest. But yeah. I mean, you can probably write it down, but the question is, what kind of why would it be useful for understanding the properties of such a system? So the reason why you like to have this energy function, because you do have this nice property, right? That the energy function decreases. And then if you have like certain, you know, well-chosen Lagrangians, then you can prove that the nonlinear equations converge to a fixed point, and this is nice. And also, like, if these, you know, matrices have zero modes, for example, you can, for example, investigate the possibility of limit cycles.
True.
Yeah, but for the Hamiltonian structure, kind of, you know, even if you can write it down, I don't really see like why it would be useful for kind of investigating the general properties of this system. But maybe it is useful for something. I just don't know.
Then I would like to thank everyone, particularly the speaker, for this exciting seminar today. And we will close the public part of the seminar. And we look forward to seeing you on this channel soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.